Hey yo, from the Kingdom of Ohio, you are listening to the Occulture podcast, where artists are magicians, where the only fixed state is transition, and where the only boundaries that exist don't actually exist at all. I am Ryan Peverly, your psychopomp for the next few minutes, or millennia, whichever you prefer. Welcome to the D program. Thanks for being here. Our house guest this time around is Cavan McLaughlin, broadcaster, creative media practitioner, and senior lecturer in media production at the University of Northampton over in the UK. Cavan has research interests around the role of spirituality and occultism in contemporary visual culture, and he's here to talk about his forthcoming book and conference, both titled Trans States. No, that phrase does not refer to any sort of identity politics, but it does refer to a sort of radical political notion that the magician, mystic, and artist all converge at one point, the proverbial crossroads, the intersection of the liminal and the numinous, and it is only at this intersection where we can truly revolt and bring down all those corrupt and out-of-date systems that only serve the few and not the many. This is hands down one of my favorite chats that I've recorded for this podcast. In the first few minutes here, you will find out why. They are extremely personal, which is why I enjoyed it so much. Cavan and I dug deep within our capital S selves to erase all borders and boundaries between him and I, and between you and us, and between you and me. Art, magic, alchemy, creativity, liminal space, and what it truly means to have a human experience. Cavan McLaughlin is in the house to talk about all that, your house, right after this.
The time has come to unshackle the beast that you have feared for so long. Relinquish your fear and submit to the cause. You will find all you need in these audio recordings. The year's 1990. Welcome to Occulture.
Cavan McLaughlin, welcome to the show, man. Really appreciate your time. Looking forward to the chat.
Yeah, thanks very much. It's great to be here, especially since so many of my good friends and colleagues have appeared on your excellent podcast. I'm very excited to be on it too.
Oh, that is very kind of you, man. And yeah, I have chatted quite a bit with people who you're familiar with, who you've worked with professionally in your research studies and so forth. And some of their names may pop up throughout the conversation here. So, but before we get to any of that, let's start with you. You know, Cavan, you are a senior lecturer in media production at the University of Northampton. You call yourself a creative media practitioner. You have research interests around the role of spirituality and occultism in contemporary visual culture. Quite a mouthful, really interesting angle into both your professional work and I guess maybe your academic work too, which overlap obviously. But tell us a bit about, when and where these interests and disciplines began to develop for you.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think it's even developed a little since then. The first Trans States conference was focused primarily on sort of visual occulture. And I think that's because I'm primarily a visual artist and I hadn't really sort of understood what I was doing more broadly in terms of writing as I do now. And actually, the first Trans States conference made me realize that limiting things to visual was an unnecessary and arbitrary sort of delineation. So I actually consider my field of research more broadly now. In terms of how and where I got into it, well, do you mean esotericism more broadly, or how it became like a field of study for me with regards to my academic career?
All of the above.
All of the above. Okay. Well, I'm Irish, so I was raised Irish Catholic. So I'm not one of these people who was reading occult books from sort of teenage years and sort of fascinated by these things. I was quite the opposite. I was absolutely terrified by these things, because that was the culture that I was brought up in, and I was taught to be terrified of these things. So I was a late bloomer in terms of my sort of personal interest in esotericism. And it's actually, well, to me, it's quite interesting because it says a lot about the manner in which I'm interested in these things. So it really came to me when I was at university in my teenage years and sort of early 20s. And so I was hugely depressed a lot of the time, which is not a strange story for someone of that age, of course. And when I got to university, I mean, it was pretty severe. It would be bedbound for days and weeks sometimes. So I was quite affected by clinical depression for a number of reasons. And I tried all of the obvious things like antidepressants and talking therapies, and I didn't find any of those particularly useful. And I became increasingly aware that I needed to find some sort of technology or practice that was going to kind of help me deal with this pathology. And I also became increasingly aware as I sort of became dissociated from myself and watched myself, how much of a burden I was to the people in my life that cared about me, particularly because of the sort of language that I was using about myself. I was like hugely negative in the way that I talked about myself and described myself. And I was constantly sort of re-narrativizing this very, very problematic and negative kind of view of myself and my identity based on like my own skewed concept of myself. And even though that's what I believed in my heart, it was really bothering the people that cared about me. And I could see how it was a self-fulfilling prophecy because I was damaging the relationships that I had. And so I started this experiment of, well, maybe I should just change the language that I use and the words that I use. And so I started telling a new story about myself, and I started watching myself and only speaking about myself in sort of positive terms, initially sort of like ironically and playfully about how great I was and how amazing I was and all of these things. But it went from being like a joke and an ironic thing to becoming more and more normalized. And I noticed it actually changed the quality of the relationships that I had with people around me. And over the course of about 2 years of experimenting with this, it completely transformed like my personality, my relationships, my life, and it changed my relationship with depression. And I was kind of blown away by how sort of the way we choose to express ourselves, the impact that can have in our lives and in the world around us. And in sort of looking at this, I kind of came across, looking for other examples of this kind of thing, I came across Robert Anton Wilson, and I read The Cosmic Trigger, which was the book that pulled the cosmic trigger for me and sort of exploded me off down this sort of esoteric rabbit hole. Because I was looking for a whole bunch of technologies, whether through different religious practices or psychotherapies or esoteric practices, you know, that might help or that were in some way connected with this sort of initial thing that I discovered about sort of the power of language and sort of expressing yourself in sort of radically new ways and sort of transforming your own understanding of the world and therefore transforming the world in essence to you. And so, yeah, it was through Robert Anton Wilson that I sort of read about other esoteric thinkers and it really snowballed from there. But I still think of it in those terms, more in terms of a sort of approach of a philosophy and a technology.
Yeah, you mentioned, you mentioned a couple of things in there that really resonated with me personally because of my own battles and struggles that, you know, I think a lot of us have that in common. And to be honest, I feel like I'm beating a dead horse here on the show, but I know that a lot of people that I've chatted with, myself included, have come to the occult or this esoteric spirituality after a bout of depression or during it or some other traumatic experience that's got you really down. And when you're really kind of, you know, searching externally for answers, I don't know how a lot of people have stumbled across this stuff, but it just seems like a common theme, more common than I would have ever thought, to be honest, but a common theme in how people discover this path and this belief system and these practices. And that's exactly how I got into this stuff to begin with was, you know, and this was just recent for me, Cavan, you know, like within the past 5 years-ish of my life. I mean, it's not been like a lifelong pursuit for me. It's been, you know, I went through a traumatic personal experience, you know, the end of a long-term romantic relationship. And I found myself just really, you know, sort of lost and searching for answers, both within myself and externally as well. And I realized that I was probably depressed. I was never diagnosed with anything. I've never been to a psychiatrist or anything like that, but I was definitely dealing with some sort of depression. And then I realized, like, man, I think I've always been dealing with some sort of depression since my teenage years on some level. And it just maybe has gotten progressively worse because I had the same patterns that you did, where you think about yourself negatively, you talk about yourself negatively. And then in these moments where, like, you try to be more positive, it almost comes off like conceited on some level. Or at least it felt that way to me. Like when I would try to think of myself or talk about myself in a positive way, maybe it was the way I was thinking or talking, but it always came off to me like, oh, I'm pretty arrogant here, like thinking this of myself. So then I'd like overcorrect and then go back to like the pessimistic view of me. And it just sunk me further down into that hole of despair or whatever I was in. And then it definitely affected my interpersonal relationships to the point where, man, I lost a lot of people who I was close to, and I lost myself too. That relationship with me was just almost non-existent. And it was sort of like reflected, outwardly with my relationships with other people as well. So, what you're saying there is, I don't know, you're catching me at a weird time here, just in terms of I've been reflecting a lot recently on, who I am and what my path forward is. And, I've decided to end this show after a while. I've been doing this for 3 years now. And I'm to the point where I feel like I've outgrown certain things. I've outgrown certain relationships. And it's just time for me to figure this out for real, and I know that what I've gotten from like this project, what I've gotten from, these conversations and this material that I've talked about with people has been very, self-empowering, and it's given me a better view of who I am, and it's helped contextualize, like kind of what I've been through, and helps shine some light on like where I can improve, for example, and how I can improve, but also like the big picture thing of like how I got here to begin with, like it's just very interesting how my life has mirrored like an alchemical process. You know what I mean? I think all of our lives do on some level, right? Like,
yeah,
I've spent all those years kind of like in the grado of life, that blackness, that darkness. And now I'm like ready to sort of transmute that into a better version of myself. But now it's like trying to figure out how exactly to do that. So I'm rambling here. This is probably the longest I've talked on this podcast consecutively with a guest. So I apologize, but
no, I win the longest and most heartfelt interjection yet. So I'm happy about that. Yeah, I mean, you brought up a lot of interesting and important things yourself there, and I don't think it's any accident that there's a correlation to like the alchemical process at all by any stretch of the imagination. And it's not just like enormously transformative like ordeals that often bring people to this material. Then often when further investigating and examining the esoteric and sort of occultural ideas, ordeals present themselves along the path. It's that wisdom through suffering sort of thing. And it's interesting because the conference, which I know we're going to go on to talk about it at some point, this next conference is being themed around the tower. And everything you were talking about there sort of reminds me of the tower, about this sort of destructive tearing down of, the security and notions of the self and structure and stability, and how it seems like the worst or one of the worst cards in the tarot deck. But it also relates to like revelation, and a thing that comes directly after that is the sort of renewed hope, and that sometimes what seems like a horrific process as we sort of step into the alchemical fires is exactly what's required to tear down the systems and antiquated and corrupted kind of structures that no longer serve us, and allow the sort of new things that sort of we need going forward to come through. And it's often a very uncomfortable process. So it's certainly not for everyone. And I've caught myself in a few situations going, why do I do this again? But, it's the only game in town if what you really care about is self-transformation, improving yourself for the better, and sort of by proxy improving the world around you for the better. And maybe I'm sort of deeply naive, but those are things that I really care about. So one can either sort of be nihilistic, or, one can sort of try to rewrite themselves in the world in new and valuable ways, which serve everybody better, and create the alchemical gold that you were sort of referring to. So,
Yeah, and I think a lot of what that process has done for me is it's really shined that light on things like vices and addictions and just self-limiting behaviors, I guess. And it's things that I never knew were, or I guess things I would never have previously classified as vices or addictions or self-limiting behaviors, but it was like something like just transformed in my brain or my psyche or something, my spirit. And it just showed me that, you know, a lot of the things that you've normalized in your life are actually the things that are holding you back. And that's a tough pill to swallow. It's an even tougher thing to like acknowledge, but it's even tougher to like counteract or reverse, I guess. You know what I'm trying to say?
But being aware of it is a really important first stage, you know, being watching yourself and the cycles that you go through and the behaviors that you return to. And, you know, the first stage is being aware of them. And I'd also add to that there's an inverse of that. There's not just an awareness of like things that you didn't previously notice were vices and don't serve you. There's also a tendency for people to kind of shadow project things about themselves that they really despise and sort of not even be entirely aware of that in all cases, like bury that and want to transform themselves from a position of these are all the things about myself that I hate and don't want to be. I read a thing not that long ago which really hit me quite hard, which was that, you know, you cannot hate yourself into a version of yourself that you love. And I think that's important too. So for me, a lot of the shadow work is about sort of integrating those things which may appear to be vices or appear to be problematic, but are actually an important part of your wholeized self. So it's both those things. It's noticing problematic behaviors and cycles. And as I say, attention on them and being aware of them is the first step, because that allows one to maybe later do something about it, flip the script or reprogram it in some way. But also being aware of sort of unconscious negative feelings towards aspects of the self that actually have value, you know, that you may not initially be aware of the value that they have. That for me has been a big part of the process as well. So embracing things which I primarily thought were problematic or vices and understanding the ways in which they serve me.
Yeah, I've done a lot of the, unfortunately, I've done a lot of the psychological projection of my shadow onto other people. And I can think of one person in general who I know listens to every episode, and she's my biggest supporter here, and I've done a lot of that to her, and I apologize to her many times privately for it, but, you know, she probably needs to know publicly that I apologize for that sort of behavior, because it really is, it sucks when you know that you've treated people like that, and you don't know how much damage it really causes until it's almost too late. And, you know, that's just, that's again, just a really hard truth to come to in your journey here. But the other thing you said too, you know, about kind of the flip side of learning maybe what you're also good at along the way too, like at the same time, you know, like I can't tell you like how many things, like talents or skills that I've discovered about myself while also trying to address those negative things, you know, those self-limiting things, like finding out what I'm passionate about and what I'm good at and where I can succeed or where I do succeed in my own life here. And that's been the flip side to that. That's the positive progress that, you know, you make along the way too. Sometimes it gets overshadowed, pun intended, you know, by all the by all the negative stuff. But at the same time, it's like, you know, you got to go through that negative stuff to find out what that positive stuff is too. And gosh, it's unfolding at the same time, which is very tough to deal with some days, you know, but, you know, I guess it is what it is. We all go through it. So, you know, and I feel like I'm making this whole conversation about me, but let's get back to...
I mean, that's not inappropriate. I mean, it's certainly not about you. It's just because we're talking about self and self-development and self-realization. So, of course, you're relating it to your own self. That's totally normal. But sorry, Where did you want to get back to?
Well, I guess I wanted to try to, you know, get back to the conference. You also have a book coming out soon, and I'd love to talk about both. And I guess we should start with the concept of both, because the book and the conference overlap. They both go under the name Trans States, which you mentioned earlier. That's TRANS space STATES. And I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about what that phrase means. And to be honest, you know, I'm an English guy. I'm like a grammar, you know, spelling, title person. So I want to know what that phrase means to you, like how you define it. Yeah. And I also want to know why there's that curious space in the middle of the name. That's really intriguing to me.
Yeah. First of all, thanks for noticing the space, because not everybody does, and it's very clearly there. I guess, okay, first of all, trans states is obviously a pun on trance states. And I quite like, working with wordplay and playing with language and puns. Gods of magic are often gods of communication and language, and trickster gods, and all of that seemed entirely appropriate. But more than that, inherent in this phrase, I wanted it to be, I've mentioned sort of elsewhere, a coincidentia positorium. So I wanted it to be a unity of opposites. I wanted to present sort of what seems to be two oppositional ideas that are in fact interconnected. So with the trans, of course, you have the meaning of beyond, through, on the other side. It has all of these like movement and active and volatile kind of traits. And with state, you have the exact opposite. A state is a condition or a way of being that exists at a particular time. And so kind of together, it has this kind of paradoxical quality of containing, in terms of, alchemically, both the fixed and the volatile, of somehow movement, but also stasis. And yet it kind of makes perfect sense as an expression, even though it seems to have this internal kind of juxtaposition. And actually, this is something I got initially from Terence McKenna, who I was influenced a lot by in my younger years. Not necessarily as a thinker, because he was often pretty off the cuff and could be like loose with his facts, as people know. But his bardic quality, I mean, he really was a magician in many ways, and his use of language is definitely entrancing. And I've listened to hundreds and hundreds of hours of his talks, and he talks specifically about this because he was heavily influenced by alchemy. And he talks about the coincidentia positorium. In fact, he actually employed it in some of his own titles, some of his earlier titles, like True Hallucinations or Invisible Landscape. You see that in Invisible Landscape, you see that tension between the seen and unseen, or True Hallucinations is purposefully playing on taking you in two different directions. And so, honestly, I wanted to come up with something that was going to be impactful and communicate a huge amount of ideas in a really short two-word phrase. And I use this concept as a way to come up with the initial phrase. And I guess the space is there to really hammer home this point that what we have is, although it's a underlying unified singularity, it is two kind of, or can be understood as two kind of separate concepts. So I want people to think about the trans and the state aspect of it as a binary, because so much of my work and so much of what I do is about looking at the binaries that we sort of project onto the world and assume, and kind of deconstruct those binaries and see how a lot of the times what we're dealing with is these as I say, unified coincidence of opposites. It's like an idiom. We have it built into our language. We talk about two sides of the same coin. So we have a deep understanding of this, how two perceived opposites can in fact transpose each other, or in many ways be the same as each other. But we don't always employ it as effectively in our everyday understanding of the world as we could. So I just wanted to make this important concept sort of front and center, because the first conference was about boundary crossing. And so right in the title there, I had the sort of description of boundary crossing within the actual the wording and the concept that I was employing.
Yeah, when I first saw the name in print of the conference, or I guess in print on the web, if you want to call that in print these days. But I thought, man, is this a typo? Is that space meant to be there? And then as I combed through more material, I was like, okay, so this is intentional, which I really love that. I love it. I love just sort of the sort of the low-key kind of playful thematic nature of it. But the first thing I thought of when I really sort of like let it register in me that it was intentional was that concept of the space between, or the concept of like liminal space even, which kind of ties back to what we were talking about earlier, where I think of liminal space differently than we talk about it these days. But I think of it as sort of like that uncomfortable space where you do feel like a little bit different or a little bit off, not yourself. Like you're sort of like in that in-between space of maybe even light and dark, if we want to go back to the alchemical theme there. So I don't know if you thought about all that, but what do you make of that interpretation of just that space in the title of these things?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the space exists sort of conceptually because we've got two different concepts. We've kind of got two categories, and by having two categories, we've created this boundary. Is it this thing or is it that thing? Which is precisely what you're talking about, and that's what creates the liminal space. And of course, liminality is absolutely key and core to sort of everything that we're doing with the conference and with my own work, but to magic more broadly, like it's in the liminality and the spaces in between where the magic really happens, both literally and figuratively. So I mean, that's absolutely not accidental, no. And that space was created, it was actively created, by an authored intention, which is also what goes on with magic. If one translates that liminal space to the concept of the magic circle, which numerous thinkers have, that's another kind of authored liminal space, which has been sort of created with the intent and will of the magician. And it creates a space outside of the norm in which you can sort of allow the radically different to come through, which is very much at the heart of kind of magical processes, I think, and artistic processes, which obviously many people, including myself, sort of see them as one and the same. I know you are sympathetic to that view yourself. So was Crowley and so is Alan Moore, of course, who've specifically made that correlation. And I think, art properly understood and revelation and magic, they all have these kind of similar idea of something outside of the world as it is sort of bleeding through, whether that's revelation, whether it's sort of new understanding, whether it's like new possibilities or future production, whether it's the creative process by some kind of unconscious creativity, like some Jungian understanding of some unconscious creative process outside of the self, creating these liminal spaces which allow the novel and the numinous to like bleed into the world. It seems to be at the heart of most of those kind of ways of interacting with the world. And that's something that I'm really fascinated by as well. I'm fascinated by the links between things, the similarities between things. Unlike a lot of academics who are hyper specialists, it's obviously an important part of academia. I'm a generalist to the extreme. The conference is a transdisciplinary conference, so it goes a further step than being interdisciplinary to trying to sort of look at concepts and ideas which are beyond and emergent from sort of the interplay between sort of different modes of thinking and thought. So, I mean, for me personally, I'm sort of very interested in how these are technologies of being in the world and how that relates to the self and how it relates to one's wider culture. And I'm sort of looking at that through all of the different lenses that I have available to me. And so this conference was special. It was experimental in being transdisciplinary, and it was particular in purposefully bringing together a meeting of different peoples. I called it a convocation, a meeting of different peoples that actually already have a discourse between them. But when one goes to conferences, often one goes to more practitioner-based, more popularized conferences, which are much more full of maybe believers and everyday practitioners of magic. And then there are other conferences which are more dry and academic and maybe try and approach the subject from this idea of being, the objective scholar who can sort of look at the subject from a distance and not be embroiled within it. And I wanted to create a space where we could purposefully cross those perceived boundaries between the academy, between the incredible independent scholars that we have in the esoteric world. And a lot of them are really capable independent scholars and have an important voice and a lot of important things to say in the subject area. And magical practitioners and artists that are interested in art produced through changes in their consciousness, but might not immediately consider themselves as being sort of esoteric artists or magically inclined. So I was interested in all the different alterations of consciousness, different forms of how psychedelics relate to this experience, how shamanic approaches or, other approaches which are really focused on purposefully shifting one's consciousness in the creation of one's art. And then just seeing putting all those people together in a room and allowing them the opportunity to approach the subject in a less stunted and structured way, maybe, and making it a bit more playful, which is an important ingredient. And just seeing what arose from that. And what arose from that was, it was a hugely successful conference, which immediately had people calling out for the second installment. The last conference was in 2016, and I would have liked to have come back after a couple of years because I pretty much do it single-handedly. So it's a huge undertaking. But we're finally back 3 years later. Who knows? Maybe I'll keep repeating them at 3-year intervals. 3 is a significant number in many of these esoteric lines of thought and religious lines of thought. So maybe it should be that way. But it was also an idea of its time, and I take that on board as well. It was definitely something, and we, just as I was talking about before, I talk about this in my class with my students, this sense of creating certain forms of art and feeling like, and writing of various kinds, and feeling like the work comes through you instead of from you, about moving yourself out of the way and some form of like inspiration sort of taking over. I think a little bit of that happened with regards to the conference. It had a whole energy of its own, and I was really sort of chasing after it in many respects. So I consider myself very fortunate to have been in the right place at the right time when this idea came around.
Yeah, you mentioned the first conference was in 2016. The book is coming out soon, and it's kind of based on or inspired by material from the presentations from that first conference, and many different voices in there, some of which people should be familiar with, obviously. The book does feature a foreword by Alan Moore, who you mentioned earlier. He's a obviously world-renowned artist and magician, and yes, those are the same things, as we know by now. But I really liked what Alan wrote here, actually, in his foreword, and
oh, it's a great foreword.
It really is. Yeah. And for people who haven't read it, not many people have read it because the book's not out yet, but I'd love it if you could maybe just summarize, since Alan's not here to speak for himself, maybe just summarize that foreword, his thoughts here for us, because they do relate to these transitional states, this liminal space that we're talking about, but I thought he had a really sort of unique angle into it.
Yeah, okay. I'll do my best to do that. I mean, first of all, so I'm at the University of Northampton. So Northampton's famous for only 2 things, really, and that is shoes and Alan Moore. And being sort of a practicing magician myself and wanting to put on an international conference on occulture, contemporary occulture, I obviously knew I wanted Alan to be there. And the reason Alan wrote the foreword is because he was one of the keynotes for the original conference in 2016. And that was part of my I wanted to have, of course, leading scholars in the field of the study of esotericism, but I also wanted to have a practitioner artist there as well, sort of speaking for the practitioner artist amongst the keynotes themselves. But I mean, it took me a long time to get to meet Alan. It took me about 2 years to get in touch with him and meet up with him. And we finally did. And he was incredibly kind to agree to do this and to also subsequently write the foreword to which you're talking about. And yeah, I mean, the foreword, obviously he's written it at length for a reason. And it's, as you've read it yourself, it's actually a beautiful piece of writing that takes you on a journey. But essentially he's talking about a a concept that he'd sort of raised earlier in his work was that the human race is approaching a phenomenon known as a phase transition period. That essentially, he gives the example of a phase transition in another situation, which is that of boiling water. That of, if you take water and, it's a substance in one state and you increase the energy, once it passes through the boiling point, it goes through a phase transition and comes out as steam and steam water vapor. And he's using that as allegorical to what's going on at the minute. And I think he has an awareness, because I think this idea came up originally around the millennium. And he has an awareness that there may be a tendency towards like a millenarianism here, and that, we're always feeling like we're on the edge of some important transitional period. But he does reflect on that, and that this is something that's happening cyclically all of the time and at different sort of levels amongst ourselves as individuals and culture. But he makes the point that this is not whatever this current moment is, it's not the innocent and carefree morning of our setting forth. So we're definitely, if we look at what's happening with the Anthropocene, if we look at what's happening culturally, if we look at what's happening with the ecological crisis, it's not just millenarianism to know that we really have reached a stage where, it seems undeniable that some kind of crisis event seems to be imminent, or at least it seems like it's going to take some sort of crisis event to have the kind of enormous transformation that we need to actually survive as a species going forward. Because there's every chance that we're one of nature's experiments and we've run our course, and if we do too much damage, I'm quite sure that the earth won't bat an eyelid in killing us off. And so, because I hate that, but people talk about saving the planet when, we really, that's true to some extent, but, what we ought to be concerned with is the extent to which we're saving our own skin. I know it's gotten to the stage that the impact that we're having on the earth is so horrendous that there are many people out there who would suggest that we ought not to be saving ourselves. And actually, the extension of the human species is the only way forward. I try and be a little bit more hopeful than that, although I'm deeply aware that I'm feeling that from the position of being human. But I still hold on to this idea that, we might pull something out of the bag at the 11th hour, and that some evolutionary shift or some kind of new technology of being might be something that will actually assist us dealing with this phase transition event. That's the same thing that Alan's speaking to as well. And I think that he sees magic similarly in that way, as partly as a radically political tool. And that we see human culture appears to be entering some kind of deeply fluid kind of phase that's nebulous and that's ambiguous in ways that we're really struggling with. And a lot of people's reaction is to run backwards, to make calls for bringing back sort of grand narratives and the kind of structural certainty of modernity. Whereas in Alan's amazing Foreword, he sees better how we might want to look at magic as a philosophy and a technology to be able to approach this new fluid and ambiguous future in a way where we might be able to traverse this period of massive change, this phase transition that we talk about. Yeah,
and you said something in there that I agree with in terms of, at some point, I just feel like Mother Nature is going to right the ship on us, and we're gonna regret that. But I have to ask. It would be a fair call if she did do that. I think we all have to recognize that. Sure, yeah. I mean, we can only do so much before somebody puts us back in our place, right? At the same time, though, I like to examine these things from different perspectives, and one of them is the role of the cynic, which I play rather well. And I just will have to ask you this, based on what you were saying there, in terms of always feeling like we're on the verge of something big, or the crisis moment, or that sort of turning point, like, oh, it's coming any day now, right? Is that maybe the hubris of being human?
In terms of over-assuming the importance of ourselves?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean,
absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, without question. And this is actually part of the problem, and can even be seen as part of the problem within esotericism, because we so often, it's the human that has the spark of the divine in them. It's the human who's the center of the mandala. And of course, that's speciest and almost certainly something that we think just because we're human. And it is definitely the case that this is thematically recurring all of the time, and that we get this sense, we have certainly overinflated the importance in previous similar sort of millenarian moments of our life. Remember Y2K, for example. I didn't buy into that, but people certainly do let this kind of sense of the importance of a kind of monumental change get carried away with it. But I just think that some of those things that we've already discussed with regards to what we're doing to the planet, with regards to the ecological crisis that we are definitely in the middle of, with regards to where we are in terms of our financial systems, it seems hard to deny, because the alternative view, which is that business as usual will be absolutely fine, seems far too problematic. So maybe it is the case that this is a kind of an inflation of our importance, but the Anthropocene doesn't seem to be an inflation of our importance. I mean, there's strong data to show the impact that we're having, that we're writing into the geological record of the planet. And if we're rewriting things to the extent that we're rewriting into the geological record of the planet, I think we need to accept that we are rewriting the world in a profound way, and that we need to take a bit more responsibility for how we are going about that rewriting. And we may be wrong, but if the response is taking radical responsibility for the way that we're writing culture and the impact that that has into the broader world, then I don't think that is in any way problematic, because only good can come of that. And I think it's an assumption that has a valuable pragmatic end.
Yeah, I would agree with that 100%, man. And, going back to the book, you wrote a piece for it yourself, obviously, the introduction, about the art of crossing over. And I am curious about, the term art there, what you mean by that. Obviously, we've been talking a little bit about crossing over in general, with the boundaries and the liminal space, but I'm curious what you mean by that phrase, the art of crossing over. Obviously, it's a multifaceted term, but, hey, I think we got time.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there again, I'm trying to have plural meanings. So I literally mean the art of crossing over as in the art and technology invested in the processes of crossing over, the art and craft of engaging in activities which are boundary crossing in some sense, whether that relates to the culture or whether it relates to consciousness. We're talking about techniques here and processes and modes of being which relate to the art of crossing over. But then also it's supposed to imply the art, which is produced because of and from the act of crossing over. So it relates both to the processes the artists undergo and also the artifacts which they create, that are created from the process of crossing over. So that was the sense in which I meant it.
Well, is there, in your head, when you're writing about that or talking through it just now, do you have like destinations in mind, whether they're physical or liminal or mental or whatever, like spiritual? Do you have, like, where do you think, like, in your own life that applies? Like, where are you crossing over from and to? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, so many different places. So, there's about the crossing over between the personal and the professional, which has happened in me sort of coming out of the broom closet, as we say. And like, there's the crossing over in terms of the subverting of the institutional space of the university to bring in this kind of material. I mean, I would resist against it being a limiting idea because I really want it to be that all-encompassing idea. And I talk about gods of boundaries, and often they're gods of magic as well. I talk specifically about Hermes as a god of boundaries and crossroads and crossing of boundaries, and about this idea how in creating boundaries, you know, which are often things that we project onto the world that aren't actually there in any kind of physical sense. It's often something ideological that we project out onto the world. And they set limits and they help us understand the world. But they also have they don't just set limits, they also create a sense of curiosity and exploration, which is something that the magician and the artist are deeply concerned with. And they also create the sense of here and there, and beyond a given boundary, we have the mysterious otherness. So just by producing a frontier, by defining a frontier, we've created a sense of self and a sense of otherness beyond the frontier. And those structures, which ourselves and society are made up of, they do restrain us and contain us, but they do serve us as well. They're double-natured too, and they're valuable. But what we have to think about is who's creating those structures, who's deciding where the boundaries lie and why. And one of the points that I make in my introduction is that something that scholars and artists and magicians that are all concerned with is the defining and redefining of these boundaries, and understanding that although boundaries seem fixed, they're actually fluid, and they're changing under various pressures of redefinition and re-narrativizing and counter-narrativizing and all of these things. And we look at the world and we see it as so fixed and rigid and structured, and people are often like, oh, this is the way it is, and it's just the way it is, and a kind of sense of hopelessness. Obviously coming from a position of seeing a need for radical change, and not just radical change, but radical empowerment of the individual to make that change. I'm very much about the democratization of the powers that are invested in these philosophies and technologies and approaches to life. And so it's important for me to promote that to other people, that they can engage in the process of redefining or reconsidering these boundaries, or at least be aware of the extent to which other people have put structures and cultural programs and stories and narratives and systems of control in place that they might not be thinking about, and therefore they're kind of subjected to them. So I'm very interested in people taking authorial control over their own understanding of the meaning and their relationship to the world, and so not being caught up in, like, again, like Terence said, if you don't have your own plan, you're a part of somebody else's plan. Or I think about Douglas Rushkoff, who's amazing, and I know you've spoken to, and his book Programmer Be Programmed. I take this to the kind of programming involved in the recodification of culture more broadly and of the self. And I see these processes as, when we engage with them, we're actively reprogramming and actively authoring rewriting our own self into the world and the culture that we're embedded in. And I want people to be actively doing that on as wide a scale as possible, because otherwise we're subject to others' cultural programming who may not have our best interests at heart. So I see this as like a radically political concern. I don't know if I drifted off there slightly, because we were talking about boundaries, but I guess the point being that it's important to realize that boundaries, they don't have to be there. Just because we need to question why they're there, if they should be there, and recognize, that they will change through certain pressures and wider discourses and various other things, and that we should all sort of engage in that process as broadly and as democratically as possible. And that's what artists do. That's what magicians do. It's no accident that so many artists and magicians are involved in radical politics as well. Those things are interconnected. It's about approaching the world concerned with transformation, concerned with a radical responsibility to kind of make better yourself in the world and reimagine it and revisioning it in a way that is beneficial to yourself, of course, but also to the others, which are really, once again, the self-other is another false binary, really, when all's said and done.
Absolutely. And you sort of bled well into my next question, but we're going to actually make a transition ourselves here from the free audience to some Patreon bonus questions. Before we do that, though, the upcoming conference that you're talking about, Trans States, the subtitle, The Art of Revelation, takes place September 13th and 14th at the University of Northampton. If people are interested in learning more about the conference or getting tickets, where can they do that?
Yeah, they can do that at our website, which is trans, as you've already pointed out, is trans-states.org. You'll forgo the space this time because your web browser won't allow it. So it's just trans-states.org. And that's our main website. And you can find out everything you need to know about the conference there, including sort of tickets for the upcoming conference. And of course, the book, which we are pretty sure, hoping will be released to coincide with the new conference. There will be details that's coming out with FULGUR Press, and there'll be details with regards to the pre-ordering of the book and its availability. We'll put that on the Trans States website as well. So everything you need to know can be found there.
Absolutely. And where can people keep up with you personally if they're interested in following more of your work?
Yeah, if they so desire, if they Google Cavan McLaughlin, there aren't that many of us. So I'm lucky to have the top few Google hits because I have such an obscure name. But they can follow me at Twitter, which is at Cavan McLaughlin, all one word. I'm available on Facebook, of course, which is facebook.com/CavanM. Again, if they just run a search on Facebook for Cavan McLaughlin, they'll figure out which of the two or three of us is me with relative ease, I would suggest. So, available through those places and through the landing page of my university. But honestly, if you Google my name, I'm easy to find.
Absolutely. We'll link all of that in the show notes for people who are interested in learning more about you, the conference, the book, and whatever else I can dig up and throw in there. So let's transition now to a few more questions here before we go for the Patreon audience. And I'm going to go back to the book for a moment. One of the more important themes in this book, we've touched on a little bit already, is that art transcends false binaries. And I'd love for you to pick that apart for us. Does that mean that art is a vehicle that allows us to cross over these invisible borders and boundaries? Or I guess, what do you mean by that exactly?
Gosh, I mean, that's a really difficult one to parse out, because I think in order to do that successfully, we would have to give an accurate, precise definition of art. And I'm sure, as you know yourself, I mean, I studied the philosophy of art in my undergrad, and we kept coming back and back and back to the impossibility. This is one of these particularly tricksterish categories that's really difficult to define. But I think for me, it has something implicitly to do with creativity, and because it has something implicitly to do with creativity, it has something implicitly to do with novelty. And because it has something to do with novelty, it has this sense of absolute alien, absolute otherness, because if it's novel, if it's created, it's come from outside into, at the very least, the cultural field or cultural fabric that we live in, right? It's come out of, it's transcendent to that and come into it. That's what being truly creative is. And And I think that there's something wrapped up in the way that we naturally and unavoidably see the world is kind of ontologically dualistic in some way. We just seem to be programmed. Maybe it's because we ourselves have this sort of bimodal symmetry, or, the hemispheres of the brain, or whatever it is, but we seem to always understand the world, certainly in terms of how we express it in language, in terms of these binaries, and we come back to them again and again and again. But we have experiences outside of language and outside of culture which seem to be non-dual. And here I think is a place of intersection between so-called mystical experiences, or psychedelic experiences regarding a loss of self, is this, sense of being beyond dualistic modes of thought, dissolving all categories so that we end up in either some kind of unity consciousness or something else, like an absolute absence, a total nothingness, like a non-self kind of state of consciousness. But the important point being is that there's some experiential place within the human condition, within the phenomenological experience, which is sort of entirely non-dual and outside of language. And I'm really interested in how occulture is the kind of expression of that into the field of culture. And so, I think that if art is coming from somewhere, if you can see my inverted commas that I'm floating into cyberspace, it's coming from this space of absolute otherness. And if our entire world is enmeshed in this kind of dualism, then this non-dualism, this non-dual state or state of consciousness, or whether it's a place or whatever it is, it's impossible to talk about. That's the point I'm making. I see this as being somewhere that novelty finds itself expressing itself into the world from. And all of these are different modes and methods of allowing that expression into the world, be it through visual art, be it through literature, be it through the ways we actually express ourselves into the world, bodily and otherwise. I have a particular fascination. So for me, there's two kinds of art. And I don't want to see, I've done it again. There's two kinds of, it's impossible to not do. But there's the remixing of culture. There's the taking things from the existing culture and remixing them, and very much what's folk culture has always been, and what we have in modern remix culture, and having something new come out of a novel reinterpretation or reassemblage. But there's another where the bricolage, the reassemblage, the juxtaposition, the rupture of the sort of existing materials is so severe that something truly new bleeds through, and we get this add-on to culture, and somehow the complexity of the universe is increased, and this is part of. And so this is a different kind of art, which is what sort of the new conference speaks to, which is the art of revelation, which is this art that comes from a place of genius, which of course has its own history of kind of referring to having a genius instead of being a genius, which, those that understand esotericism understand well. And this Jungian idea of some kind of external agent outside, beyond the self, like coming through the self into the culture. That's a different kind of art, I think. And that's the thing that I'm really fascinated. Even in my own work, when I'm sitting there trying to produce something like particularly creative, and I'm like hammering away and trying to come up with ideas, and really, really working at it, because one tries to make the inspiration happen, and if the inspiration's not there, then as a creative you have to continue anyway. But I'm also interested in, what can I do to create that situation where I'm really just there trying to scribe, trying to catch a hold of whatever is moving through me and exploding out of me. What techniques, and so that's an art in itself, the ways and modes of creating the situation within which that happens, relating back to what we were talking about previously. And you look at that, you're like, well, look, okay, so if we're talking about magic, like I want to have a conversation with an angel. Well, if you want to have a conversation with an angel, then it certainly helps to like go about casting magic circles and engaging in angelic scripts and having, the whole hoo-ha that's involved in that process, because it's a technology, it's an art of creating a situation which can allow that sort of outcome to occur, right? You're going to have a much more easy situation doing that than I don't know, sitting in a takeaway joint with your friend going, I'm going to have a chat with an angel right now. And I'm not suggesting that that's impossible, but you see what I mean? There's an art to facilitating and making places more thin places, which allow this sort of novelty and absolute otherness to find its way into the world. And that can be mystical revelation. It can be artistic output. It can be understood in a number of different ways, depending on the individual that's doing it. But at heart, it's the same thing, I think.
Yeah, I think it is. And I don't really have much more to add to that, because I'm just sort of, what's funny, man, is that, and I feel comfortable saying this on Patreon because it's a smaller, more intimate audience, but I can just listen to people talk about what they're passionate about for hours.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That's kind of like why I do this. But I also find like at times I almost sort of like drift into that sort of like dreamy state of like, oh man, like this person is just kind of like, is just hitting me in the feels, as they say on the internet, right? But right. So I'm not really sure what to add to that. So I'm just going to transition to the next point. But I thought that was a great answer, and I'm thanks for characterizing that, because you're right, it was a pretty complex question. Like, what is art? Well, shit.
Possibly impossible, but hopefully there was some kind of reasonable answer.
Absolutely. I think it was pretty reasonable, and I just found myself sort of like, I was just like nodding along, So my apologies if I was too quiet there. But, I want to ask you about, since we are on Patreon too, like I said, a little bit smaller audience here, but, so I won't spoil too much. But I'd like to give a sneak peek of what your presentation is for this upcoming conference. It's called Revisionary Myth-Making, the Antidote to Codified Structural Oppression. That sounds epic as fuck. So what could people expect? And, I don't know how many patrons in the audience are going to be able to get to the show or to the conference. So, don't feel like you can't talk about it, but don't feel like you have to spoil everything either. I know just from reading about you online a little bit too that this might be also in line with a PhD that you either were or are working on. At least it sounds sort of like from the title sort of similar. So just take us through that. Give us a little preview of what that conference presentation is going to be like. And also, I guess, how it does tie into your PhD work if you're still doing that.
Yeah, I mean, my PhD work, it is related to this. Gosh, you do like small subject areas for questions. I mean, my PhD is occultural production as revisionary myth-making. So I spent a lot of time looking at what occulture is and how it can be understood and its interplay with culture. That's what I'm interested in terms of my PhD and a lot of my broader research. And I'm sort of reframing it in my PhD as revisionary myth-making. And so it actually relates hugely to a number of things that I've been talking about right here, which is, well, the concept of revision was introduced by a feminist poet and a theorist called Adrienne Rich. She came up with the theory in like a really famous essay of hers in 1972, where the act of revision was this act of like, it was a reflexive act of like looking back anew, of seeing with fresh eyes, because the future self, just like the past self, is an other self. And she was fascinated how being an other self gave one the capacity to look at the old codified culture, the old narrative structures, and be able to take them in a new critical direction, which of course is what I've been talking about generally. And I think this was applied quite specifically in feminist theory, particularly to literature, but maybe the rewriting of history as well. But I would like to see it applied across the cultural spectrum. I'm quite influenced by post-structural theory, as I kind of intimated again in the previous discussion. And rather than sort of run back to trying to come up with new grand narratives and new firm sort of narrative structures which give us some sense of stability, I think that, well, first of all, nobody, heeding the past, through rose-tinted glasses going, in the good old days, that to me rings warning bells straight away. And I'm more interested in how we can evolve to move forward and sort of find our way out of our current situation by developing ourselves. And the interesting thing about revisionism is that it is involved precisely in that. It's important. It relates to self-writing as much as it does to rewriting the cultural texts that we're embedded in, because we ourselves are stories to a certain extent. We talk about the narrative self or the narrative identity. The neuroscientists, sort of Anil Seth and others, talk about this, that we're a complex of selves, and one of those selves is the narrative self, the narrative identity. It's the story we tell about ourselves, to ourselves and to others. And that relates directly to what I was saying sort of earlier, like learning these early on, almost by accident, as like technologies of rewriting myself, and kind of being aware of the extent to which the self and the culture are enmeshed and interrelated. And what we're actually talking about here is sort of rewriting the self and rewriting culture more broadly. So it's reflexively rewriting the past within the cultural field of the present. It's like being aware to the extent of which we're confined to some extent within codified structural oppression. And there's a lot of talk going on about this at the moment. And of course, it's not all bad, because these stories have been completely invaluable in our evolution, in proliferating our species, in maintaining cohesion and direction and social order. And, that's why we've had the success that we've had. But these can be damaging, and they can be imprison us also. And now we're in this like hyper networked global discourse, this culturally constructive discursive environment. I think we really need to look back to this concept of sort of revisionism, and we need to look at how narrativity and the codified culture, the language of culture, is like all technologies. It's a double-edged technology, and it can liberate and heal us, or it can traumatize us and enslave us. And I'm talking about the power of authorship, how it sits with all of us. And so revisionary myth making, it's like a form of reclaiming that power when faced with oppressive and harmful narratives, and flipping the script. And that's what I'm going to be talking about a methodology for creating new possibilities for the future, instead of maybe harking back to some of the aspects of the past, which of course did serve us. But there is no going backward. There's only going forward. And I feel like we need to learn how to deal better with ambiguity and fluidity and pluralism and shifting between multiple working models of understanding the world. And how I'm going to fit all of that into 20 minutes. This is something that academics do all the time. We write this abstract and go, that sounds like a brilliant idea, but what I've actually done there is I've written the abstract for a paper and not for a full article and not a 20-minute paper. But actually, this is from material that comes directly out of my PhD, because I've become quite well known for talking about occulture because it's such a complex and nuanced concept that there's really a lot to say about it. And I was aware that this conference, some of the themes are around trauma, and they're around deconstructing and reconstructing cultural texts and so on. And so this part of my PhD, revisionary myth making and what it is and how it can be used as a model that we need to reclaim more of the really valuable stuff in this really important feminist concept and apply it to culture in a much more widespread way than we have to date. I wanted to kind of speak to that at the conference.
Yeah, man, absolutely. Thanks for taking us through that a little bit. If you need 20 minutes, I can just send you that clip and, hopefully you can maybe just play it for the audience there. That's fine. Just take 20 minutes of this chat and just play it. So, I am a big proponent too of what you were talking about in terms of, taking the power of your own authorship, over your life back and kind of like reconstructing your own narrative. Because a lot of people fall into that trap where, I think of it more, I think of it in terms of purpose too, I think what's uniquely human about, what's uniquely human about humans, I guess, is that we all want to feel purposeful, right? We all want to feel like our life has meaning. Yeah. And I think that one of the low key sort of behind the scenes magic tricks of whoever you want to, describe as, or however you want to describe the people pulling the strings here, whether it's the elite, quote unquote, or the Illuminati, like these conspiratorial terms. I have no idea who it is. I don't even know if it's real. I don't know if anybody's doing it. But I know that there is some sort of accepted invisible force, whether it's positive like God or negative, like the global banking cartel or whoever it is. But I think that whoever it is knows that's sort of the defining characteristic of humanity at its core, is that we all individually want to feel like we have meaning and purpose. And the thing is that they have no problem coming into your life and giving you that purpose and that meaning. And they do that in terms of slave wage jobs, slave labor, or just these sort of meaningless, endless, mindless tasks that we have to do every day almost, pay bills or whatever else, just these things that don't bring us any joy whatsoever. But the thing is that you've sort of, and that might be the structural oppression that you were talking about there, it's this weird, and it's very esoteric, and it's very conspiratorial too on some level. But I just think that because we need purpose and meaning, that there's some force out there that has no problem creating purpose and meaning for you, even though it's not fulfilling, A lot of people think that my day job, my career, my profession is my purpose. It's what I'm meant to do. And I'm sorry, but no, that's not true. That's the structural oppression, sort of rearing its ugly head and saying, hey, yeah, you are a human being. You want purpose and you want meaning for your life. So why don't you stand in this factory for 12 hours a day and pump out auto parts? That's your purpose and meaning? No, I don't think so. But it's very easy when you don't take that authorship of your own story back to fall into that sort of, that's a dangerous area to fall into, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, and I do think it is created by individuals and groups to some extent that have grown to understand this. I wouldn't lean into a conspiratorial reading. I mean, conspiracies happen, and there are a number of them, but I think it's naive to think of an overarching conspiracy. And I think personally that probably reflects the same desire for there to be a force or power in control of everything, like God. I think those are similar desires, whereas in reality, it's probably more likely that nobody's driving the bus and nobody really has any idea what's going on. But there are certainly groups of various sizes and individuals which understand how the construction of meaning and constructing meaning and ideology and sort of worldview and these things for people can be a way of, as you say, motivating this intense desire to have meaning in a way to control them. I mean, codified structural oppression is more broad than that, but that absolutely goes on. There's no question. And it may be the case that there is, some ultimate meaning. I mean, here we go back to my multi-model agnosticism coming through again. So apologies for never being able to nail me down to anything. It may well be that, or it may be that there's absolutely no meaning whatsoever, that this nihilistic thing that meaning is entirely constructed by humans. But if that's the case, that creates that creates an incredible space where we can create our own meaning, and we can play. I think about this a lot. Okay, I think about I'm going a bit random here, but I think a lot about when you talk about codified structural oppression, right? Think about, we're living in a world where people are doing their jobs and everybody has this role and that role, and it's all culturally sanctioned and understood. And I look at it a lot of the time and I'm like, we're living in a world of people who are still in the playground playing make-believe and dress up, and they've convinced themselves that it's real. We're all taking on these roles, we're putting on the uniforms, we're speaking the script, and actually we're just playing a huge game of make-believe with the deceit and conceit that we've forgotten that that's what it is, and that we can remake it any way that we want. And that's what I would like people to play with, because the current mythology, as you've pointed out, that meaning is from finding your place, your particular cog in the great machine, and the wage slavery that you will engage with until you give the best years of your life to something that you don't want to do. And then in the closing years of your life, you'll finally get to have some sort of enjoyment that you've earned. It's so bizarre. It's completely crazy that we bought into this on a mass scale, and wage slavery is exactly what it is. And, bringing play back into the world and allowing people to break out of the forms of meaning that they're surrounded by, that entrance them in their own way. That, I don't want to get into these asleep awake kind of things, which can be problematic, but there is kind of a sense of being a reactor or an actor, in your experience of the world. And I know this because I have experiences of being lost and reacting to everything and being bounced around like a pinball. And then every now and again, I catch myself and I go like, oh, wait, hang on. I can make choices here. I can choose how I feel about a certain thing. I can choose how I respond or act in this situation. I don't have to just immediately respond the way the situation itself would suggest I should respond. And I regain my autonomy, and I regain my freedom and my liberty. And that is the sole focus of my life, is to remain in that state as much as possible, because it's a really unexpected and rarefied thing to exist at all, and to have one of these experiences of being. And I want to make the absolute most of it, and I want that for everyone else as well.
Well, Cavan, I think that's a great note to wrap up on. So I really appreciate your time. I really appreciate you fielding these questions, because they're not easy. And like you said, well, I guess you joked around how they're small questions, right? No, they were really not. They were actually big questions with big answers. So I appreciate you playing along with me here. Before we go, is there anything else you'd like to say about the conference or the book for our Patreon audience?
Yeah, no, I don't think that there's any specific information just for the Patreon audience. I think we got it all previously. So thank you very much for the opportunity for me to speak about the conference and the work that I'm doing. And thank you very much for what you're doing with the podcast. It's been a great value to my life. So I appreciate all the hard work you've put into that yourself.
Well, thank you so much, man. That's totally kind of you. And, the least I can do is share my own journey with people and hope that it resonates with them and that they take something from, the hours and hours of material that I put out there. I appreciate you engaging with it yourself. And it's a really small world, like, just when you think about it, I never would imagine that I've talked to some of the people I've talked to here and about the things that I've been talking with them about. So I learned something from everybody, and I got so much out of this chat. I just wanted to thank you for that, for especially playing along near the beginning when I got real personal there. So thanks for listening, man.
No, I'm actually honored that you wanted to put that forward. So thank you for doing that. It's quite special that you felt comfortable and that it was appropriate for you to share like that. So thanks for doing that.
No problem, man. No problem. It's the least I can do for you. So, I only got a few episodes left. It's these kind of chats, that really, I think, mean the most to me. I can talk to people about books about fucking UFOs, whatever. But it's this sort of stuff. It's the personal transformation stuff, that really, I don't know. That's going to sit with me for a long time. And I appreciate you bringing that aspect of your work here and sharing it with everybody. And I know that, to be honest, these are the types of chats that resonate the most with the audience too. Like there's a million podcasts talking about, things like UFOs and conspiracies and the occult in general, magic, whatever. But there's not a lot of people out there talking about it from a level like I think we got to. So I really appreciate that.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye. And there you have it. My thanks again to Cavan McLaughlin. I'll tell you what, I don't even know what to say after this one. This chat to me while I was having it just felt like a dreamscape. I wasn't lost in it, but I was definitely sort of floating through it, because that beginning portion really caught me off guard, but I just went with it, and I'm glad I did. That was some real magic right there, two grown-ass men opening up about their battles with depression, and a continual quest to not just overcome that, but transmute it into something positive, something beautiful born out of tragedy and hopelessness, something that resembles hopefully on some level a living, breathing piece of art, and thus an act of magic, if you will. I mean, there is no greater achievement in this life than the fusion of flesh and spirit and breathing those in together. You really are a walking, talking art installation, and some days you're gonna feel ugly, sad, depressed, frustrated, angry, and it's okay to experience those emotions, to let them pass through you, but understand that they are just passing through. Emotions are temporary. Do not let those negative emotions root in you, because that's when they become feelings. And negative feelings are much more difficult to transition away from. Believe me, I've been trying to do that for, probably 20 years now. And I understand that my canvas here is a work in progress. It will never be complete until my flesh begins to decay and decompose. And when that happens, I do not want my traumas to bleed into the earth. I do not want to leave behind any memory of misbehavior, be it mental or material. I want to take the pain and I want to transmute that into pleasure, and I will. And so will you, because that's what we do. We transition from one state to another constantly, endlessly, from peaks to valleys, highs to lows, ups to downs, strikes to gutters, dude. But I'm tired of seeing people who hit 10 pins in one frame and 2 pins the next. I've done that for years. I'd much rather get 7, 8, 9 pins every frame. I'm never going to roll a perfect game, but at least I'll be consistent every time out. That's the real art and magic and alchemy you've been reading about, that you've been listening to others talk about all these years. Oh, there is a physical component to it, sure. There's real physical treasure out there for the taking, don't get me wrong. But it's not gold, not money, not jewels, not material, not possessions. It's being able to hold someone close to you and know that you have their back and they have yours. Because you've both been through those alchemical fires, because you've both been destroyed by those fires, but you've also been cleansed. Purged of the venom in your voice and the fear in your heart. Time to put down the sword, because you're only stabbing yourself here. And pick up the pen instead, or the brush, or the wand, and rewrite, or redraw, or recast the story of you, because when you do that, you also recast the story of us. And as a magician much more magical than me once said, time to evacuate the venom in the fear that binds you, and chase away that deceiver inside yourself. It's been a long time coming. Anyway, in the Patreon extension, another 26 minutes with Cavan, where we talked about how art transcends false binaries. Cavan also gave us a sneak peek of his presentation at this year's Trans States conference called Revisionary Mythmaking, the Antidote to Codified Structural Oppression. We also talked a little bit about taking the authorship of your own story back. Great stuff in that extension for sure. And if you're in the UK or around the UK, and you can get to the Trans States Conference September 13th to 14th, I'd highly recommend it. I don't think you will regret it at all. Anyway, my thanks to new patrons William, Kyle, and Steve for their recent contributions to the Patreon campaign. If you're interested in hearing the extension with Cavan or any other extension from past guests, patreon.com/occulture is the place to do so. And that puts a bow on yet another episode here. My apologies for talking so damn much, but I'm not holding back anymore. This is me. And as this podcast winds down, I don't have a lot of fucks left to give, so take what I say or leave what I say. Doesn't matter much to me, but know that I mean every goddamn word of it, because this is my love language. and I'm not going to let you down. So until next time, you've just been initiated into Occulture. I am Ryan Peverly reminding you to love yourself, think for yourself, and question authority.